In the gaslit corridors of Cambridge Hospital in 1887, patients would smile when they heard her footsteps approaching. Doctors praised her dedication. Families left their loved ones in her care without a second thought. They called her Jolly Jane, and to everyone who met her, she embodied everything a Victorian nurse should be: cheerful, competent, and blessed with an almost supernatural ability to ease suffering. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that this woman who brought such comfort was conducting the most twisted experiment in human cruelty ever recorded. While families slept peacefully in waiting rooms, Jane Toppin was methodically poisoning their loved ones, not out of mercy, but for the pure, intoxicating pleasure of watching them die. Her name was Honora Kelly, and she was born into the kind of poverty that proper Boston society preferred to forget. March 1854, in the Irish tenements where immigrants huddled against winter and prejudice alike. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Honora was barely old enough to remember her face. Her father, Peter Kelly, was known throughout the neighborhood by a nickname that said everything about his mental state: Kelly the Crack. Peter was a tailor who had been slowly unraveling for years. The grief of losing his wife, combined with alcohol and the crushing discrimination Irish immigrants faced in America, had twisted him into something barely recognizable as human. The neighbors whispered about his violent outbursts, his descent into madness. And then came the story that would haunt his daughter forever, that in his final act of desperation, Peter had attempted to sew his own eyelids shut with needle and thread. Whether this horrific tale was true or simply urban legend doesn't matter. It became the foundation myth of Honora's childhood, the moment that taught her that the world was a place where people destroyed themselves and abandoned the ones they were supposed to protect. At age 6, Honora was surrendered to the Boston Female Asylum, where she learned her first and most important lesson: become whoever they want you to be, or disappear entirely. She mastered the art of charm, transforming herself into the bright, helpful girl that prospective families might actually want. And it worked. In 1862, Mrs. Ann Toppin of Lowell, Massachusetts, selected her for indentured servitude. The transformation from Honora Kelly to Jane Toppin was more than a name change. It was the systematic erasure of everything Irish, everything poor, everything real about her identity. The accent was beaten out of her. The storytelling that had once charmed other orphans was forbidden. Every trace of her true self was buried beneath layers of enforced respectability. But Mrs. Toppin had a daughter, Elizabeth, who possessed everything that Jane would never have: genuine love, inheritance rights, a secure future. Jane watched Elizabeth grow up in the same house, seeing daily what her life might have been if she had been born into the right family. The resentment built slowly, like poison accumulating in the bloodstream. For 23 years, Jane remained in that household, first as servant, then as unpaid help. She watched Elizabeth marry a respectable deacon and move into her own comfortable life, while Jane remained trapped in servitude. By the time she finally found the courage to pursue nursing, something fundamental had crystallized inside her. If the world insisted on treating her as disposable, she would return the favor with interest. Cambridge Hospital welcomed Jane with open arms in 1887. At 33, She was older than most nursing students, but her warmth and competence quickly made her a favorite. She earned her nickname through seemingly endless cheerfulness and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate her patients' needs. What she had actually discovered was something that filled the void where love and belonging should have been. In the hospital's medicine cabinets, she found morphine and atropine, powerful drugs that could transport a person to the very edge of death and back again. And in her patients, she found the perfect subjects for her private experiments. Jane began carefully, selecting elderly patients who were already expected to die. She would alter their prescribed dosages, adding her own combinations to see what effects they would produce. The morphine would slow their breathing to dangerous levels, while the atropine would cause hallucinations and convulsions. The two drugs had opposite effects on pupils, morphine contracting them while atropine dilated them, meaning that when used together, they would mask each other's most obvious symptoms. What Jane discovered in those early experiments would define the rest of her life. She derived sexual pleasure from watching her victims die. She would monitor their breathing, watch their eyes, feel their pulse grow weak, and when she was certain they were in their final moments, she would climb into bed with them, holding their convulsing bodies as life slipped away. One patient, Amelia Finney, later recalled a terrifying encounter from 1887. After surgery, Jane had given her bitter medicine that caused her to lose consciousness. Finney awoke to find Jane in bed with her, kissing her face while she lay helpless. At the time, she convinced herself it had been a dream. Only years later, when Jane was arrested, did she realize the horrifying truth. Despite whispers about Jane's obsession with autopsies and her tendency to be present when patients took unexpected turns for the worse, hospital administrators saw only dedication and skill. When Massachusetts General Hospital requested a recommendation, Jane's name topped the list. At Mass General, Jane's experiments continued and expanded. She no longer limited herself to the dying. She chose patients who particularly appealed to her or reminded her of people she resented. The thrill was becoming addictive, and her methods were growing bolder. By her own later confession, Jane killed at least a dozen people during her hospital years. She perfected her drug combinations, learning exactly how much morphine was needed to induce respiratory failure, exactly how much atropine was required to cause maximum terror. She kept careful mental notes of which mixtures produced the most interesting death agonies. But Jane's recklessness with opiates eventually caught administrators' attention. She was fired from Mass General and returned to Cambridge, only to be dismissed again for the same reason. By 1890, her hospital career was over, but her killing career was just beginning. As a private duty nurse, Jane found new freedom. Wealthy Boston families hired her to care for sick relatives, and she moved seamlessly from household to household, always arriving with impeccable references. What clients didn't know was that Jane was using their homes as private laboratories, testing new methods of murder. In 1895, Jane took rooms with an elderly couple named Israel and Lovey Dunham. She found them feeble and fussy, as she later explained. Israel was first to die, apparently of heart failure. 2 years later, Lovey joined him. Jane had learned patience, spacing murders to avoid suspicion while maximizing opportunities to study the dying process. But the most revealing aspect of Jane's psychology emerged in her treatment of her foster sister, Elizabeth. In 1899, Elizabeth invited Jane for a family vacation. Jane saw this as an opportunity to settle old scores with the woman who had possessed everything she'd been denied. Elizabeth fell ill during the vacation, suffering symptoms that mimicked a stroke. Jane nursed her tenderly, playing the devoted sister while slowly poisoning her with strychnine. Elizabeth's death was mourned as tragedy, and Jane was praised for her selfless care. After Elizabeth's death, Jane made a calculated move. She returned to Lowell and moved in with Elizabeth's widower, Oromel Brigham, claiming she wanted to help him through his grief. What she really wanted was to become the next Mrs. Brigham, finally claiming the life she felt had been stolen from her. Jane's plan involved systematic manipulation. She would poison Oromel just enough to make him ill, then nurse him back to health, demonstrating her value as both caregiver and potential wife. But Oromel proved resistant to her charms, and Jane's presence became increasingly chaotic. When Oromel's sister Edna came to visit, Jane saw her as an obstacle. Within days of Edna's arrival, she was dead from Jane's signature morphine and atropine combination. Jane watched with satisfaction as Edna convulsed and died in agony. Oromel had seen enough. He ordered Jane to leave, threatening police involvement if she caused more trouble. Jane's response was typically dramatic. She attempted suicide with morphine, though whether this was genuine or manipulation remains unclear. Jane's killing spree was about to reach its climax in a way that would finally expose her to the world. The Davis family had been renting their cottage to Jane for years. When she fell behind on rent, Mattie Davis decided to collect what was owed. It was a decision that would cost Mattie her life. When Mattie arrived, Jane welcomed her warmly and offered refreshments. The water was laced with morphine, and within hours Mattie was desperately ill. Jane played the concerned friend, nursing Mattie through 7 days of agony while experimenting with different drug combinations. Mattie died in horrible pain. But Jane wasn't finished. She convinced the grieving widower, Alden Davis, to let her stay and help care for the household. Within weeks, Alden and his 2 married daughters were all dead. The rapid succession of deaths in a healthy family finally aroused suspicion. Captain Gibbs, one victim's husband, had noticed his wife seemed frightened of Jane in her final days. He demanded his wife's body be exhumed for examination. The results were conclusive: morphine and atropine poisoning. Investigators discovered Jane had been purchasing large quantities of morphine by forging prescriptions throughout Boston. On October 29, 1901, Jane Toppin was arrested, ending a 16-year killing spree. In custody, she displayed disturbing lack of remorse. To psychiatrist Dr. Henry Stedman, she boasted, "I fooled them all. I fooled the stupid doctors and the ignorant relatives." Jane confessed to 31 murders, though investigators suspected the true number was much higher. She described her methods in clinical detail, explaining how she'd perfected drug combinations to produce maximum suffering. She spoke of climbing into bed with dying victims, deriving sexual pleasure from their final convulsions. When asked about motivation, Jane's response was chilling. She had wanted to kill more helpless people than anyone in history. It wasn't about money or revenge. It was about the pure, intoxicating power of controlling life and death. Jane's trial began June 25th, 1902, largely a formality given her obvious guilt and questionable sanity. She insisted she was perfectly sane, arguing that her awareness of right and wrong proved her mental competence. The jury deliberated 27 minutes before finding Jane not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed for life to Taunton Insane Hospital, where she spent the remaining 36 years of her life. Even in the asylum, Jane's murderous impulses never disappeared. Nurses reported she would call them to her cell and whisper, "Get some morphine, dearie, and we'll go out in the ward. You and I will have a lot of fun seeing them die." Jane Toppin died August 17th, 1938, at age 84. Her death briefly revived interest in one of America's first recognized serial killers, but unlike the killers who followed, Jane's story has largely faded from memory. Perhaps this obscurity is intentional, a collective decision to forget the friendly nurse who turned healing into horror. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a cheerful smile and speaks in soothing tones while orchestrating unimaginable suffering. Jane Toppin proved that monsters don't lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they work in hospitals, live in respectable neighborhoods, and earn entire communities' trust. They hold our hands when we're vulnerable, promise to ease our pain, and smile warmly as they guide us toward death. In an era when we place our lives in medical professionals' hands daily, Jane's story serves as a haunting reminder that those we trust most may be the ones we should fear. Her legacy isn't just a catalog of murders. It's proof of how easily evil can hide behind competence, how charm can mask cruelty, and how the desire for power over life and death can corrupt even those sworn to heal. Jolly Jane, the friendly nurse who brought comfort to the dying, had spent 16 years studying the precise moments when life surrenders to death. She had transformed the sacred act of nursing into a sadistic experiment in human suffering, proving that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who never stop smiling. In the morning light of June 8th, 1927, a well-dressed stranger stood by the roadside in Minnesota, waiting for a ride. He wore a crisp blue suit, a colorful sweater, gray cap, and polished tan shoes. He carried nothing, just a quiet smile and the kind of earnest demeanor that made decent people want to help. When the Chandler family spotted him, they didn't hesitate to pull over. He was polite, soft-spoken, and seemed harmless enough. They had no idea they were giving a ride to the most feared serial killer in North America. They had no idea that the man sitting in their car had already strangled more than 20 women across the United States. They had no idea that in just days, this stranger would murder a 60-year-old landlady and a 14-year-old girl in Winnipeg. The man they knew only as a friendly hitchhiker was Earl Nelson, but the newspapers called him something else entirely. They called him the Gorilla Man. Earl Leonard Nelson was born on May 12, 1897, in San Francisco, into what should have been a normal American family. But normal was never in the cards for Earl. Just 15 months after his birth, tragedy struck in the cruelest way possible. Both of his parents died of syphilis, leaving the infant orphaned before he could even walk. He was sent to live with his maternal grandmother, Jenny Nelson, a devoutly religious Pentecostal who believed that emotions, feelings, and especially sexual desires were tools of the devil himself. The Nelson household was a place where joy was suspicious, laughter was forbidden, and any display of natural human feeling was beaten out of you with righteous fury. Jenny Nelson didn't raise Earl with love. She raised him with fear. Every day was a lesson in shame. Every natural childhood impulse was evidence of sin. She filled his head with hellfire and damnation, convinced that the world was a wicked place, and that salvation could only come through absolute repression of human nature. But if Earl's early childhood was already twisted by religious extremism, what happened when he was 10 years old would break something inside him forever. While riding his bicycle near his home, Earl collided with a streetcar. The impact was devastating. His head struck the pavement with such force that witnesses thought he was dead. He survived, but the boy who woke up was not the same boy who had been riding that bicycle. The head injury left him with seizures, violent mood swings, and what doctors would later describe as a constitutional psychopathic state. But more than that, it seemed to unlock something dark that had been sleeping inside him. After the accident, Earl began experiencing vivid hallucinations. He would claim to see angels and demons, to hear voices commanding him to do things. His behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. By age 14, his grandmother could no longer control him, and he was institutionalized at Napa State Mental Hospital. At Napa, doctors observed a teenager who alternated between periods of religious fanaticism and explosive violence. He would spend hours reading the Bible, quoting scripture with the fervor of a preacher, and then suddenly lash out with terrifying fury. The doctors couldn't help him because they didn't understand what they were dealing with. The term serial killer didn't exist yet, and the kind of darkness growing inside Earl was beyond their comprehension. When World War I broke out, 18-year-old Earl Nelson enlisted in the U.S. Navy, desperate to escape the hospital and prove himself a man. But military discipline and his fractured psyche were never going to coexist peacefully. Within months, he was discharged for psychological reasons, sent back into a world that had no place for him. For the next few years, Earl drifted through California, committing petty crimes and struggling with the voices in his head. He married briefly, but the marriage collapsed when his wife could no longer tolerate his increasingly strange behavior. He would disappear for days, come home speaking in tongues, and fly into rages over imagined slights. By 1925, something inside Earl Nelson had crystallized into pure malevolence. The confused, damaged boy had become something else entirely. He had become a predator. His method was simple and devastatingly effective. Earl would walk through residential neighborhoods, looking for houses with room for rent signs in the windows. He carried a Bible and dressed respectably, cultivating the image of a quiet, religious man looking for decent lodging. When a landlady answered the door, Earl would speak softly, quote scripture, and ask to see the room. His manner was so gentle, so humble, that women felt safe letting him into their homes. He seemed like the kind of tenant any respectable woman would want, clean, polite, and God-fearing. But once he was inside, once the door closed behind him, Earl Nelson transformed. The mild-mannered stranger became something monstrous. With hands that witnesses described as abnormally large and powerful, he would grab his victims by the throat and strangle them with terrifying efficiency. But murder wasn't enough for Earl. After killing his victims, he would rape their corpses, satisfying twisted desires that the outside world could never have imagined. Then he would ransack the house, stealing money and valuables before carefully hiding the body under a bed, in a closet, or behind furniture. His first confirmed kill came in February 1926 when he murdered a woman in her 60s in San Francisco. 2 weeks later, another woman was found strangled, then another in June. The pattern was always the same: middle-aged landladies found strangled in their own homes, their bodies carefully concealed. Witnesses who had seen Earl leaving these crime scenes described him to police as a dark, stocky man with long arms and large hands. The description reminded people of a gorilla, and newspapers began calling the unknown killer the Gorilla Man. Others dubbed him the Dark Strangler. But regardless of the name, the message was clear. A monster was loose on the streets of America. What made Earl Nelson so terrifying wasn't just his brutality, but his mobility. Unlike killers who operated in a single city, Earl was constantly moving, riding trains from state to state, leaving a trail of bodies across the country. In an era before modern communication and coordinated law enforcement, he was like a ghost, appearing in one city, killing, and vanishing before authorities even realized they were dealing with a serial murderer. After terrorizing San Francisco through the summer of 1926, Earl moved north to Portland, Oregon. On October 19th, he murdered 35-year-old landlady Beata Withers, stuffing her body into a steamer trunk in her attic where her teenage son would later find it. The next day, he killed 59-year-old Virginia Grant, hiding her body behind the furnace in her basement. From Oregon, he moved inland, killing in Seattle, then traveling east across the country like a plague. Each city brought new victims, new families destroyed, new communities living in fear. Detroit, Chicago, Kansas City, Philadelphia, the Gorilla Man left his mark everywhere he went. The authorities were helpless. They had no way to track a killer who never stayed in one place long enough to establish a pattern they could predict. By the time they realized a murder fit the Gorilla Man's methods, he was already hundreds of miles away, hunting in a different state. But Earl's mobility was both his greatest strength and ultimately his greatest weakness. In June 1927, after more than a year of killing across the United States, he made the decision that would finally bring his reign of terror to an end. He crossed the border into Canada. On June 9th, just one day after the Chandler family dropped him at the border, Earl Nelson knocked on the door of Emily Patterson, a 60-year-old widow who rented rooms in her home in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Using his familiar routine, he inquired about lodging, was invited inside, and murdered her within minutes. He hid her body under the bed and ransacked the house. But Earl wasn't finished with Winnipeg. On June 10th, he approached 14-year-old Lola Cowan as she walked home from school. Lola was staying with relatives while helping to care for an ailing family member. She was young, innocent, and utterly defenseless against the predator who had been hunting women for over a year. Earl lured her to a vacant house where he strangled and raped her. Her body was found the next day, and the community of Winnipeg erupted in outrage and terror. 2 murders in 2 days, both bearing the unmistakable signature of the Gorilla Man, meant that America's most wanted killer was now in Canada. But unlike the scattered police departments of the United States, Canadian authorities were better coordinated. They immediately sent Earl's description to every police station between Winnipeg and the U.S. border, correctly guessing that he would try to flee back to America. On June 15th, 1927, Earl Nelson was spotted walking toward the U.S. border near the small town of Wacopa, Manitoba. When police approached him, he gave them a false name, claiming to be Virgil Wilson, a traveling salesman. But his nervous demeanor and the fact that he matched the description of the Gorilla Man perfectly made officers suspicious. They arrested him and locked him in the town jail, but Earl wasn't ready to surrender. That evening, using a nail he had hidden on his person, he managed to pick the lock of his cell and escape into the Canadian night. For 12 hours, Earl Nelson was free again, walking through the darkness toward what he thought would be safety in the United States. But fate had other plans. When he finally reached a train station, hoping to catch a ride back across the border, the train that pulled up was carrying Winnipeg police officers returning from another case. The manhunt was over. After 16 months of terror, 22 confirmed murders, and a killing spree that had crossed international borders, the Gorilla Man was finally in custody. Back in Winnipeg, authorities photographed and fingerprinted their prisoner. When they sent his fingerprints to police departments across the United States, the results were immediate and conclusive. The man calling himself Virgil Wilson was indeed Earl Leonard Nelson, wanted for murders from California to Pennsylvania. At his trial in November 1927, Earl Nelson maintained his innocence, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints had been found at multiple crime scenes. His teeth marks matched bite wounds found on victims. Witnesses from across North America identified him as the man they had seen near the boarding houses where murders occurred. Perhaps most damning of all, Earl could provide no alibi for any of the times and places where murders had occurred. For a man who claimed to be an innocent traveling salesman, he had been in remarkably close proximity to an extraordinary number of violent deaths. The jury deliberated for just 40 minutes before finding him guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging. Even facing execution, Earl Nelson never showed genuine remorse for his crimes. He continued to maintain his innocence, to quote scripture, and to present himself as a misunderstood man who had been falsely accused. His lawyers argued that he was insane, that the head injury he had suffered as a child had damaged his brain beyond repair. But the courts had heard enough. In the 1920s, the justice system had little patience for psychological explanations of criminal behavior. Earl Nelson had killed at least 22 people, had terrorized communities across 2 countries, and had shown himself to be an ongoing threat to innocent women everywhere. On January 13th, 1928, 30-year-old Earl Leonard Nelson was led to the gallows in Winnipeg. He had been given the opportunity to make a final statement, but he declined to speak. As the noose was placed around his neck, witnesses reported that he showed no emotion, no fear, no acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed. At 7:41 a.m., The trap door opened, and the gorilla man fell to his death. The execution of Earl Nelson marked the end of one of the most notorious crime sprees in North American history. In an era before the term serial killer had been invented, before criminal profiling and modern forensic science, he had demonstrated just how much damage one person could inflict on society. His case would later be studied by criminologists and psychologists trying to understand the mind of a serial killer. Some pointed to his traumatic childhood, others to the head injury that had changed his personality. Still others noted the toxic combination of religious fanaticism and sexual repression that had characterized his upbringing. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Earl Nelson's story is how ordinary he appeared to his victims. He wasn't a wild-eyed maniac or an obviously dangerous person. He was polite, soft-spoken, and carried a Bible. He looked like someone you could trust, someone you could safely invite into your home. The women who answered their doors to Earl Nelson had no way of knowing that behind his gentle facade lurked one of the most violent predators in American history. They saw a quiet man seeking lodging and made a decision that cost them their lives. In the end, the Gorilla Man's legacy is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and warning signs. Sometimes it knocks politely on your door, speaks softly about finding a room to rent, and quotes scripture while hiding unspeakable intentions. Earl Nelson proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the most harmless person you could imagine, right up until the moment they reveal what they really are. In the dim light of a hospital bed in 1946, a 17-year-old boy lay broken and bleeding. His skull was fractured from 3 clay flower pots that had been smashed over his head during his arrest. Blood seeped through bandages as police officers stood around him, demanding answers to questions about 3 brutal murders that had terrorized Chicago for months. The boy's name was William George Heirens, and within days, he would become known as the Lipstick Killer. But this isn't a story about guilt or innocence. This is a story about how a brilliant young mind became the center of one of Chicago's most controversial criminal cases, and how the truth became lost somewhere between coerced confessions, police brutality, and a city's desperate need for justice. William George Heirens was born on November 15th, 1928, in Evanston, Illinois, to parents who had fled poverty in Luxembourg seeking the American dream. What they found instead was a different kind of struggle. George Heirens worked long hours, while Margaret tried to hold together a household where love was scarce and arguments were constant. Young William learned early that the safest place wasn't home, but the empty streets where he could disappear into his own thoughts. By age 11, something inside William had already begun to twist, not toward violence, but toward rebellion. He wasn't interested in toys or games like other children. He was fascinated by locks, by windows left open, by the thrill of entering places where he didn't belong. It started small, just wandering into unlocked apartments, not to steal but to explore, to feel the rush of being somewhere forbidden. At 13, police found him carrying a loaded gun. When they searched his family's property, they discovered something that would haunt his future: a storage shed filled with stolen goods, guns, furs, cameras, jewelry, all carefully hidden like trophies. But here's what was strange. William never sold anything he stole. He hoarded it all, as if the act of taking was more important than the value of what he'd taken. The authorities sent him to the Gibol School for Wayward Boys, the same institution that would later house Charles Manson. When that didn't work, they tried St. Bede Academy, a Catholic school known for discipline and structure. But something unexpected happened there. William excelled, not just academically, but exceptionally. His grades were so remarkable that at 16, he qualified for the University of Chicago's Special Learning Program for Gifted Students. By 1945, William Hirons was living what seemed like two completely different lives. By day, he was a university student studying electrical engineering, taking ballroom dancing classes, playing chess, dating classmates. He was intelligent, charming, well-liked. But by night, he was something else entirely. The old compulsions had returned, stronger than ever. He was breaking into homes across Chicago's affluent North Side, not for money, but for the same inexplicable thrill he'd felt as a child. What William didn't know was that while he was living his double life, someone else was leaving a trail of bodies across the same neighborhoods where he prowled. On June 5th, 1945, 43-year-old Josephine Ross was found dead in her apartment on North Kenmore Avenue. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the throat, her wounds carefully taped with adhesive, and her head wrapped in a dress. Her apartment had been ransacked, but nothing valuable was missing. Police found dark hairs clutched in her hands and no fingerprints anywhere. The murder barely made the local news. 6 months later, on December 11th, 1945, the violence escalated. 32-year-old Frances Brown, a former Navy wave, was discovered in her apartment with a bread knife lodged in her neck and a bullet wound to her head. Like Ross, her body had been washed in the bathtub, her wounds taped, and her head covered with fabric. But this time, the killer left something else. Scrawled in Brown's own lipstick on the bathroom wall were the words that would define the case. "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." The message sent shockwaves through Chicago. Here was a killer who seemed to be pleading for help, begging to be stopped. The media immediately dubbed him the Lipstick Killer, and panic spread through the city's north side like wildfire. But the worst was yet to come. On January 7th, 1946, 6-year-old Suzanne Dagnan was discovered missing from her bedroom in the affluent Edgewater neighborhood. A ransom note demanding $20,000 had been left behind. But before her parents could even attempt to pay, the unthinkable happened. Parts of Suzanne's dismembered body were found in the sewer system near her home. She had been kidnapped, murdered, and butchered with what appeared to be surgical precision. Chicago was in full panic now. 3 brutal murders, seemingly random, committed by someone who moved through the shadows like a ghost. Police were under enormous pressure to find the killer, and they were getting nowhere. The murders seemed to have no connection other than their brutality and the killer's bizarre post-mortem rituals. Then, on June 26th, 1946, 6 months after little Suzanne's murder, William Hirons made a mistake that would change everything. He was caught in the act of burglary in an apartment building on North Kenmore Avenue, the same street where Josephine Ross had been murdered. When police arrived, William ran. When they cornered him, he pulled a gun and tried to shoot an officer in the head. The gun misfired. In the struggle that followed, An off-duty officer smashed 3 clay flower pots over William's head, fracturing his skull and leaving him unconscious. When William woke up in the hospital, he found himself at the center of the biggest murder investigation in Chicago's history. His fingerprints, the police claimed, matched prints found on the ransom note in the Degnan case. Suddenly, the quiet university student was the prime suspect in 3 of the city's most horrific murders. What happened next would become one of the most controversial interrogations in American criminal history. For 6 days, while William lay in a hospital bed with a fractured skull, police questioned him around the clock. No attorney was present, no parents were called. When he refused to confess, they injected him with sodium pentothal, a so-called truth serum, without his consent or a warrant. When that didn't work, they gave him a spinal tap without anesthetic to see if he was faking his injuries. Under the influence of the drug, William began speaking about an alter ego named George Merman, who he claimed might have committed the murders. Police launched a massive manhunt for this mysterious George, questioning everyone William had ever known. But George Merman didn't exist. He was either a product of the drugs, a psychological defense mechanism, or a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion. Meanwhile, the Chicago Tribune published a front-page story claiming that William had confessed to all 3 murders, complete with lurid details. The story was entirely fabricated, written by a reporter who wanted to sell newspapers. But other papers picked it up, and soon the entire city believed that the lipstick killer had been caught and had confessed. William's attorneys told him the truth. With the media circus and public outrage, a fair trial was impossible. He would certainly be sentenced to death. Their advice was simple: confess to avoid the electric chair, take a plea deal for life in prison, or face certain execution. Faced with this impossible choice, William did what anyone might do to save their life. He confessed. Using details from the fabricated newspaper article and information police had fed him during interrogation, he crafted a confession that satisfied the authorities. On August 7th, 1946, he formally pleaded guilty to the murders of Josephine Ross, Frances Brown, and Suzanne Dagnon. But almost immediately, William began recanting his confession. He claimed it was coerced, that he had only confessed to save his life, and the evidence seemed to support his claims. Handwriting experts, both police and independent, found no connection between William's handwriting and the lipstick message or the ransom note. 29 major inconsistencies were found between his confession and the known facts of the crimes. The supposed fingerprint evidence was questioned by multiple experts as potentially planted. Even more troubling, during the original investigation, police had actually arrested another suspect, Richard Russell Thomas, a drifter who had also confessed to murdering Suzanne Dagnon. Thomas had a history of violence, medical training that could explain the surgical precision of the dismemberment, and had been in the area during all 3 murders. But when William became the focus, Thomas was quietly released and his confession forgotten. William Hirons was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. He immediately began proclaiming his innocence, a claim he would maintain for the next 65 years. He became a model prisoner, earning a bachelor's degree from Lewis University, helping other inmates with legal issues, and consistently requesting parole. Every year, Suzanne Dagnon's surviving siblings would appear at his parole hearings to ensure he remained behind bars. On March 5th, 2012, William Hirons died in prison at the age of 83. He had spent 65 years behind bars, making him the longest-serving prisoner in Illinois history. To his last breath, he maintained his innocence. But here's what makes this case so haunting. William Hirons was undoubtedly a burglar. He had been breaking into homes since childhood and never denied it. But was he a killer? The evidence suggests that a 17-year-old boy with no history of violence was coerced into confessing to murders he may not have committed in an era when police brutality was commonplace and suspects had few rights. The real lipstick killer may have been Richard Thomas, who died in an Arizona prison in 1974, his confession lost to history. Or it may have been someone else entirely, someone who got away with 3 brutal murders because the police needed a suspect and William Hirons was convenient. What we're left with is a story that reveals something disturbing about the nature of justice itself. Sometimes, the truth doesn't matter as much as the appearance of resolution. Sometimes, society needs a monster so badly that it will create one, and sometimes, the real monsters are the ones wearing badges. William Hirons lived his entire adult life in a cage, possibly for crimes he didn't commit. He never got to marry, never had children, never experienced freedom. His story is a reminder that the most terrifying evil isn't always the obvious monster. Sometimes, it's the slow, methodical destruction of an innocent life in the name of justice. In the end, we may never know if William Hirons was the lipstick killer or simply its most tragic victim. But his story stands as a testament to how easily truth can be buried under pressure, fear, and the desperate human need to believe that every story has a clear ending, every crime has a perpetrator, and every monster has a name. The real horror of the lipstick killer case isn't just the 3 brutal murders that terrorized Chicago. It's the possibility that justice was never served at all, and that the true killer walked free while an innocent man spent 65 years paying for crimes he may never have committed. In a small apartment in Los Angeles, 1957, a young woman named Judith Dull adjusted her hair in the mirror one last time. She was excited about the modeling opportunity ahead of her. A photographer named Johnny Glenn had promised her work for a detective magazine, something that could launch her career in the entertainment capital of the world. Her roommates at the El Mirador apartment building barely glanced up as she left with the quiet, bespectacled man who had come to pick her up. He seemed harmless enough, thin and awkward, carrying camera equipment like any professional photographer might. What they didn't know was that they were watching the final moments of Judith's life, and the man she left with wasn't Johnny Glenn at all. His real name was Harvey Murray Glatman, and he was about to begin a killing spree that would terrorize Los Angeles and redefine how the world thought about serial murder. Harvey Glatman was born on December 10th, 1927, in the Bronx, New York, but darkness followed him from the very beginning. His parents, Albert and Ophelia Glatman, were Russian and Polish Jewish immigrants who had hoped for a better life in America. Instead, they found themselves raising a child who seemed fundamentally different from other children, a boy whose inner world was twisted by impulses they couldn't understand. Even as a young child, Harvey displayed behaviors that should have been warning signs. He began experimenting with autoerotic asphyxiation at age 12, tying ropes around his neck and nearly strangling himself for sexual pleasure. When his parents found him, they took him to a doctor who dismissed it as a phase he would grow out of. But Harvey wasn't going through a phase. He was developing what would become his signature method of murder. As a teenager, Harvey's behavior escalated. He began breaking into women's apartments, not to steal valuables, but to take intimate items, particularly undergarments. He would study these women, learning their routines, feeding fantasies that grew darker with each passing day. His parents tried to control him with strict discipline, but their harsh punishments only seemed to fuel his resentment toward authority and his twisted relationship with power and control. In 1946, when Harvey was just 19, his compulsions finally exploded into violence. He kidnapped and sexually assaulted a woman in New York. The attack was brutal and calculated, showing a level of planning that terrified investigators. Harvey was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison, first at Elmira Reformatory, then at Sing Sing, the same prison that had once housed the notorious child killer Albert Fish. During his imprisonment, psychiatrists diagnosed Harvey with psychopathic personality disorder with schizophrenic tendencies. They noted his sexually perverted impulses and warned that he was a severe danger to society. But despite this diagnosis, Harvey proved to be a model prisoner. He was intelligent, scoring 130 on IQ tests, and he knew exactly how to manipulate the system. He learned to say the right things, to appear reformed, to convince the authorities that he had changed. In 1948, after serving only 2 years of his sentence, Harvey was granted parole. It was a decision that would cost multiple women their lives. For nearly a decade, Harvey managed to stay out of trouble, at least officially. He moved to Los Angeles and opened a television repair shop, presenting himself as a quiet, hard-working man trying to build a normal life. But beneath this facade, Harvey was cultivating two hobbies that would prove to be a deadly combination: photography and rope work. He spent hours perfecting his camera techniques, learning about lighting and composition. At the same time, he practiced intricate rope knots, studying bondage techniques with the same dedication another person might apply to a craft or art form. To anyone watching, he might have seemed like a lonely man with innocent hobbies. In reality, he was preparing for murder. Harvey's plan was brilliantly simple and terrifyingly effective. Los Angeles in the 1950s was filled with young women dreaming of stardom. They came from small towns across America, drawn by the promise of Hollywood, willing to take almost any opportunity that might lead to fame. Harvey understood this desperation, and he knew how to exploit it. Using various aliases, Harvey began contacting modeling agencies and placing ads in newspapers, posing as a photographer who worked for detective magazines and pulp fiction publications. These magazines, popular at the time, often featured photos of women in distress, bound and gagged as part of dramatic crime scenarios. To young women trying to break into modeling, these seemed like legitimate, if slightly unconventional, opportunities. Harvey was methodical in his selection process. He looked for women who were isolated, who had few close relationships, who wouldn't immediately be missed if they disappeared. He presented himself as professional and harmless, a shy man who seemed incapable of violence. His apartment was set up like a legitimate photography studio, complete with professional lighting and camera equipment. Everything was designed to put his victims at ease. On August 1st, 1957, Harvey put his plan into action for the first time. 19-year-old Judith Dull, who went by Judy, answered his advertisement for modeling work. She was exactly the type of victim Harvey had been looking for: young, ambitious, and relatively isolated. When Harvey, using the name Johnny Glenn, arrived to pick her up, her roommates saw nothing suspicious about the encounter. But once Harvey got Judy to his apartment, the pretense dropped completely. He held her at gunpoint, tied her up with the ropes he had spent years perfecting, and began photographing her. The pictures he took were not for any magazine. They were trophies, documentation of his complete power over another human being. Harvey, who was still a virgin at 29, raped Judy repeatedly while she was bound and helpless. For Harvey, this wasn't just about sexual gratification. It was about control, about the ability to completely dominate another person. He later told police that he felt more alive during these moments than he ever had before. The camera served multiple purposes. It allowed him to document his crimes, to relive them later, and to hide behind a sense of professional purpose, even as he committed horrific acts. After hours of assault and photography, Harvey drove Judy out to a desolate area in the desert east of Los Angeles. There, under the vast California sky, he strangled her to death with a rope, using the same techniques he had practiced on himself as a child. He left her body in the sand and drove home, where he developed the photographs and mounted them on his apartment walls like artwork. The murder of Judith Dull might have remained unsolved forever, but Harvey was just getting started. The success of his first kill had awakened something in him that demanded to be fed again and again. 7 months later, Harvey changed his approach. Instead of targeting aspiring models, he decided to explore a different pool of victims. He placed a Lonely Hearts advertisement in a Los Angeles newspaper, presenting himself as a lonely bachelor looking for companionship. The ad attracted the attention of Shirley Ann Bridgeford, a 24-year-old single mother who was hoping to find love after her divorce. Shirley was everything Harvey pretended to be looking for in his advertisement: kind, trusting, and eager for human connection. When they met for their date on March 9th, 1958, she had no reason to suspect that the awkward, soft-spoken man across from her was a killer. Harvey suggested they drive out to a scenic location for a picnic, and Shirley agreed. But instead of a romantic evening, Harvey drove Shirley to the same desolate area where he had killed Judy. Once they were alone, he revealed his true nature. He forced Shirley from the car at gunpoint, tied her up, and began the same horrific ritual he had performed with his first victim. He photographed her terror, assaulted her, and ultimately strangled her to death. Harvey later told investigators that Shirley had begged him to let her go, promising she wouldn't tell anyone what had happened. She had a young son at home, she pleaded, who needed his mother. Harvey listened to her desperate words with complete indifference. To him, her humanity was irrelevant. She had become an object, a plaything for his twisted desires. Harvey's third known victim was Ruth Mercado, a 24-year-old aspiring model. In July 1958, Harvey returned to his original method, contacting her through a modeling agency using the alias Frank Johnson. Ruth was feeling ill on the day Harvey arrived for their scheduled photo shoot, but Harvey insisted they proceed anyway. When Ruth's condition worsened, Harvey told her to rest while he prepared his equipment. Instead, he spent the time planning her murder. Later that evening, he let himself into her apartment and spent the entire night sexually assaulting her at gunpoint. Ruth's neighbors later reported hearing sounds of distress throughout the night, but no one called the police. In the morning, Harvey forced Ruth to walk to his car and drove her to his killing ground in the desert. Before murdering her, he told investigators he actually felt a connection to Ruth. "She was one I really liked," he later confessed. But this feeling of connection didn't stop him from strangling her to death and leaving her body to decompose in the California heat. Harvey's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely, but his fourth intended victim proved to be his downfall. On October 27th, that's 1958, Harvey targeted 28-year-old Lorraine Vigil, another aspiring model who had responded to his photography advertisement. But Lorraine was different from Harvey's previous victims. She was more alert, more suspicious of his behavior. When Harvey began driving away from the city instead of toward his studio, Lorraine became alarmed. She demanded to know where they were going, and when Harvey's answers didn't satisfy her, she realized she was in danger. As they drove through Tustin, California, Lorraine noticed a police officer and began honking the horn and screaming for help. Harvey panicked and pulled out a gun, but Lorraine fought back with a desperation born of absolute terror. She grabbed the steering wheel, causing the car to swerve wildly, and continued screaming even as Harvey tried to control her. The commotion attracted the attention of California Highway Patrol Officer Thomas F. Mulligan, who pulled them over. When Mulligan approached the vehicle, he found Harvey holding a gun on a terrified woman who was clearly being held against her will. Lorraine immediately told the officer she was being kidnapped, and Harvey was arrested on the spot. During his interrogation, Harvey shocked investigators by confessing not only to the kidnapping attempt, but to the murders of Judith Dull, Shirley Ann Bridgeford, and Ruth Mercado. He seemed almost relieved to be caught, describing his crimes in vivid detail and showing investigators where he had hidden the bodies of his victims. What disturbed investigators most was Harvey's complete lack of remorse. He spoke about the murders as if they were technical achievements, discussing his methods with the detached interest of someone describing a hobby. He showed them the photographs he had taken, explaining his techniques and the pleasure he derived from documenting his victims' final moments. The photographs themselves became crucial evidence in Harvey's trial. They showed the progression of each crime, from the initial deception to the final moments before murder. The images were so disturbing that even experienced detectives struggled to look at them. They revealed not just the physical brutality of Harvey's crimes, but the psychological torture he inflicted on his victims. Harvey's trial began in December 1958 and lasted only 3 days. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His confession, the photographs, and the testimony of survivor Lorraine Vigil. Harvey showed no emotion throughout the proceedings, sitting quietly as prosecutors described his crimes in graphic detail. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Harvey's response was chilling in its simplicity. "I just want to die." He refused all appeals and even wrote to the court asking them to expedite his execution. It was as if, having been caught, he saw no point in continuing to exist. On September 18th, 1959, Harvey Murray Glatman was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. He was 31 years old. His final words to his executioners were reportedly calm and matter-of-fact, maintaining the same detached demeanor he had shown throughout his trial. Harvey's crimes had a lasting impact far beyond his 3 known victims. His case was one of the first to highlight the dangers faced by young women pursuing careers in entertainment, leading to changes in how modeling agencies operated and how they screened potential photographers. His methodical documentation of his crimes also provided investigators with unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. In the years since Harvey's execution, criminologists have studied his case as an example of what they call a signature killer, someone whose crimes contain specific ritualistic elements that reflect their psychological needs. Harvey's use of photography, his elaborate bondage techniques, and his preference for extended control over his victims all became part of his signature. Perhaps most disturbing is that Harvey's crimes might have remained undetected indefinitely if not for Lorraine Vigil's quick thinking and desperate fight for survival. Unlike later serial killers who sought publicity or left deliberate clues for investigators, Harvey was content to kill in silence, collecting his photographic trophies and moving on to the next victim. In 2009, more than 50 years after Harvey's execution, investigators linked him to a 4th possible victim, Boulder Jane Doe, whose body had been found in Colorado in 1954, was finally identified as 18-year-old Dorothy Gay Howard from Phoenix, Arizona. The circumstances of her death, she had been bound, assaulted, and murdered in Harvey's signature style, suggested she might have been an early victim from his time in Colorado. The identification of Dorothy Gay Howard raised haunting questions about how many other victims Harvey might have claimed during his decade of freedom between his release from prison and his final arrest. How many young women had disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found, their cases never connected to the quiet television repairman with his camera and his ropes? Harvey Glatman represents something particularly disturbing in the annals of criminal history. The killer who hides in plain sight, who appears harmless and ordinary while harboring the darkest of impulses. He was neither the most prolific nor the most famous serial killer, but his crimes revealed a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. His story serves as a reminder that evil often wears the most ordinary faces, that monsters can blend seamlessly into society while planning acts of unthinkable horror. Harvey Glatman proved that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those we never see coming, those who appear so normal that we invite them into our lives without a second thought. In the end, Harvey's legacy is not one of infamy or notoriety, but of the cold, calculated destruction of innocent lives. He remains a footnote in criminal history, remembered mainly by those who study the darkest aspects of human nature. But for the families of Judith Dull, Shirley Ann Bridgeford, Ruth Mercado, and possibly Dorothy Gay Howard, his name represents an evil that can never be forgotten or forgiven. The photographs Harvey took, intended as trophies of his power, ultimately became the evidence that sealed his fate. In trying to capture and preserve his moment of ultimate control, he created the very proof that would lead to his own destruction. It was a final irony in a life that had been built on deception, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of human dignity. Harvey Glatman died as he had lived, quietly, methodically, and without apparent emotion. But the terror he inflicted on his victims, the trauma he caused to their families, and the darkness he revealed about human nature continue to echo long after his execution. His story reminds us that evil is not always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it is simply a quiet man with a camera and a rope, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. In the late 1960s, the college towns of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, Michigan, were everything America wanted to be: young, hopeful, filled with promise. Students walked freely across tree-lined campuses, hitchhiked without fear, and believed in a future bright with possibility. The Vietnam War raged thousands of miles away, but here, among the ivy-covered buildings and autumn leaves, life felt safe, protected, normal. But something was hunting in the shadows. Between July 1967 and July 1969, 7 young women would vanish from these very streets. They were students, dreamers, daughters with entire lives ahead of them. Each would be found days or weeks later, their bodies discarded like broken dolls in fields, cemeteries, and remote locations within a 15-mile radius of the campuses. They had been sexually assaulted, brutally beaten, and murdered in ways that defied comprehension. The killer moved like smokes through the community, invisible, trusted, and utterly ruthless. For 2 years, he terrorized southeastern Michigan, turning college towns into landscapes of fear, and parents stopped letting their daughters walk alone. Dorm rooms were locked tight. An entire generation learned to look over their shoulders. And the most terrifying part? The monster they were looking for was hiding in plain sight. John Norman Collins was everything a mother could want in a son. Born in 1947 and raised in Center Line, Michigan, a modest suburb north of Detroit, he grew up in what appeared to be a typical American family. He was handsome with dark hair and sharp features that made him popular with women. He played football, attended church regularly, and was known for his polite manners and easy smile. Collins was the kind of young man teachers remembered fondly, neighbors trusted, and parents encouraged their daughters to date. He enrolled at Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti to study elementary education, a career choice that spoke to his desire to work with children. He lived in a fraternity house, had friends, and seemed destined for a comfortable, ordinary life. But beneath that all-American facade, something dark was stirring. The first victim was 19-year-old Mary Flezer, a quiet EMU student from Willis, Michigan. On the evening of July the 9th, 1967, Mary decided to take a walk near her apartment in Ypsilanti. It was a warm summer night, the kind where college students would stroll through town, enjoying their freedom and the promise of endless tomorrows. Mary never returned home. For nearly a month, her fate remained unknown. Then, on August 7th, 1967, construction workers discovered her remains on an abandoned farm in Superior Township. What they found was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Mary's body had been stabbed approximately 30 times across her chest and abdomen, but the killer hadn't stopped there. Her feet had been severed at the ankles. Her left forearm and hand were missing entirely, as if the killer had taken trophies. The brutality was so extreme, so personal, that investigators initially believed this was an isolated incident. Someone had known Mary, they reasoned. This level of violence had to be personal. They couldn't have imagined that this was just the beginning. Almost exactly 1 year later, the killer struck again. Joan Schell was a 20-year-old EMU student with long brown hair and dreams of becoming a teacher. On the evening of June 30th, 1968, she was last seen hitchhiking in front of the Eastern Michigan University Student Union. Witnesses saw her get into a late model red and white car with 3 young men inside. She was laughing, seemingly comfortable with her ride. A week later, her body was found near Glacier Way and Earhart Road in Ann Arbor. She had been stabbed multiple times, her throat slashed, and she showed signs of sexual assault. Her blue miniskirt was found wrapped around her neck like a grotesque noose. 2 months after Joan's murder, investigators received a break when 2 witnesses came forward claiming they had seen Joan walking with a young man along Emmett Street on the night she disappeared. Both witnesses believed the man looked like John Norman Collins, the clean-cut EMU student who lived directly across the street from Joan at 619 Emmett Street. When questioned, Collins was cooperative, even charming. He flatly denied knowing Joan Schell and provided what seemed like a solid alibi. He claimed he had spent that weekend with his mother in Center Line and hadn't returned to Ypsilanti until the morning of July 1st. The police, seeing no reason to doubt this all-American college student, took him at his word and moved on. They had no idea they had just interviewed a killer. On March 20th, 1969, the predator's appetite escalated. Jane Mixer, a brilliant 23-year-old University of Michigan law student, posted a note on a campus bulletin board seeking a ride to her hometown of Muskegon. She wanted to tell her family about her engagement and her plans to move to New York. Jane was days away from graduating, her whole life mapped out ahead of her. She vanished that evening. Jane's body was discovered the next day in a cemetery just inside Wayne County. Unlike the previous victims, she had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. Her body was fully clothed except for her shoes, which were placed neatly beside her. Stockings were twisted around her neck. The killer had tried a different method, but the signature was unmistakable. The careful staging, the sexual overtones, the cold calculation. By now, law enforcement knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. 6 separate police agencies joined the investigation. The media dubbed the unknown perpetrator the Michigan Murderer, the Ypsilanti Ripper, and the co-ed killer. But still, he remained invisible. The killing spree reached a horrifying crescendo in the spring and summer of 1969. On March 24th, 16-year-old Marilyn Skelton was last seen hitchhiking in front of Arborland Mall on Washtenaw Avenue. Her body was found on Pemberton Drive in Ann Arbor, only a quarter-mile from where Joan Schell had been discovered. Marilyn had been beaten to death with such force that her skull was completely shattered. 3 weeks later, 13-year-old Dawn Basom became the youngest victim. The 8th grader was visiting a friend when she decided to walk home before dark, telling her friend's family she needed to get back. Her body was found the next day at Gale and Vreeland Roads, strangled with black electrical wire. Her body bore slashes across her breasts and buttocks, and a handkerchief had been stuffed into her mouth. In June 1969, 23-year-old Alice Kalam disappeared after working her shift at a local shop. Her body was found north of Ann Arbor, but unlike the other victims, Alice had been shot and showed signs of decomposition, suggesting she had been held captive before being killed. By this point, terror had completely gripped the college communities. Students traveled in groups, dormitories implemented strict curfews, and parents begged their daughters to come home. The killer seemed to be accelerating, growing bolder, more confident in his ability to hunt and kill without consequence. But like all predators, his arrogance would eventually become his downfall. On July 23, 1969, 18-year-old Karen Sue Beineman, an EMU student from Grand Rapids, took a trip to downtown Ypsilanti to buy a wig. It was a bright afternoon, the kind of day that felt safe and normal. At Emily's wig shop, she selected a hairpiece and chatted with the owner, Deanna Ghosh. As Karen prepared to leave, a young man on a motorcycle pulled up outside. He was clean-cut, handsome, wearing a neatly pressed shirt. He looked like any other college student. Diana Ghosh later remembered Karen's exact words as she watched the young man waiting outside. "I've got to be either the bravest or the dumbest girl alive, because I've just accepted a ride from this guy." Those would be among the last words Karen Sue Beineman ever spoke. 3 days later, her body was found on Riverside Drive in Ann Arbor Township. She had been strangled and beaten so severely that her face was unrecognizable. Like the others, she had been sexually assaulted and her body carefully positioned. But this time, the killer had made a critical error. The break in the case came from the most unlikely source imaginable, Colin's own uncle. Michigan State Police Corporal David Lake was going on a 2-week vacation and asked his nephew, John Norman Collins, to watch his house on Roosevelt Street in Ypsilanti while he was away. When Corporal Lake returned from vacation, something felt wrong. Things in his house weren't as they should be. Most notably, someone had painted over a section of the basement floor. Lake found this strange since he hadn't authorized any painting and the area hadn't needed it before he left. Curious and increasingly suspicious, Lake scraped at the fresh paint and found what appeared to be blood underneath. Though it later turned out to be varnish, Lake's instincts told him something wasn't right. He contacted the detectives investigating the murders and mentioned his nephew's strange behavior. For investigators, this was the first real lead that pointed to a specific suspect. When they compared Collins to the composite sketches generated from witness descriptions, the resemblance was unmistakable. More importantly, witnesses at Emily's wig shop positively identified Collins as the young man who had picked up Karen Sue Beineman on his motorcycle. On July 31st, 1969, John Norman Collins was arrested for the murder of Karen Sue Beineman. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Collins was no mysterious drifter or obvious outsider. He was a local boy, a college student, someone who had walked among them undetected for 2 years. Students who knew him from classes or fraternity parties struggled to reconcile the charming young man they remembered with the monster police claimed he was. During questioning, Collins maintained his innocence with the same calm demeanor that had allowed him to evade suspicion for so long. He denied ever meeting Karen Sue Beineman, despite multiple witnesses placing them together. His attorney later said Collins insisted he had never even heard her name. The trial of John Norman Collins began on June 2, 1970, and became the longest criminal trial in Washtenaw County history. The prosecution's case centered on eyewitness testimony, placing Collins with Karen Beineman just before her disappearance, along with testimony from his friend Arnold Davis, who claimed to have seen Collins disposing of women's clothing and jewelry after the first police interview. The most damning evidence came from a groundbreaking forensic technique. Hair samples found on Karen Beineman's body were subjected to neutron activation analysis, the first time this technology had been used to solve a murder case. The analysis showed that the hairs contained elements that matched samples taken from Collins's uncle's basement, providing physical evidence linking Collins directly to the crime scene. Collins chose not to testify in his own defense, perhaps understanding that his charm and ability to manipulate would not work on a jury that had heard the horrific details of what had been done to these young women. On August 19th, 1970, after deliberating for several hours, the jury unanimously found John Norman Collins guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Karen Sue Beineman. When the verdict was read, Collins remained eerily calm, showing no emotion, even as his mother and sister fled the courtroom in tears. Judge John Conlon sentenced Collins to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Before imposing the sentence, the judge asked if Collins wished to address the court. Collins rose and said simply, "I think they conscientiously tried to give me a fair trial. The jury did not take its task lightly, but I think things were blown out of proportion. The circumstances surrounding this case prevented me from getting a fair trial." When the sentence was announced, Collins made his first and only public statement about the crimes. "I never knew a girl named Karen Sue Beineman. I never took the life of Karen Sue Beineman." While Collins was only convicted of one murder, investigators firmly believed he was responsible for all 7 deaths attributed to the Michigan murders. The killings stopped completely after his arrest, and the pattern of violence was too consistent to be coincidental. However, without sufficient physical evidence linking him to the other crimes, prosecutors chose to focus on the Beineman case, where they could guarantee a conviction. The case that terrorized southeastern Michigan for 2 years was finally closed, but the psychological mystery of John Norman Collins remained. How does a seemingly normal young man transform into one of the most brutal serial killers in American history? Those who knew Collins before his arrest described him as charming, intelligent, and helpful. His teachers at Eastern Michigan University remembered him as a dedicated student pursuing a career in elementary education. His fraternity brothers saw him as sociable and well-liked. Even his neighbors in Center Line recalled a polite young man who attended church regularly with his family. But investigators who studied the case believe there were warning signs that went unnoticed or were dismissed. Collins had been questioned earlier in the investigation when witnesses identified him as possibly being with Joan Schell on the night of her disappearance. Yet his clean-cut appearance and confident demeanor allowed him to deflect suspicion. Perhaps most chilling was Collins' ability to compartmentalize his actions. During the 2 years he was actively killing, he maintained his academic performance, his social relationships, and his public image. He attended classes, participated in fraternity activities, and even helped with some of the early searches for missing students. This psychological duality fascinated criminologists and helped establish some of the early profiles of what would later be called serial killers. Collins was organized, methodical, and capable of planning his attacks while maintaining a completely normal facade. He selected victims who were vulnerable, young women walking alone or hitchhiking, and he struck when opportunities presented themselves. The geographical pattern of his crimes also revealed a calculating mind. All the victims were found within a 15-mile radius of the EMU and University of Michigan campuses, areas Collins knew well from his daily life as a student. He disposed of bodies in locations that were remote enough to delay discovery, but familiar enough that he could navigate them confidently. Collins changed his last name to Chapman while in prison and has maintained his innocence for over 50 years. He has refused multiple opportunities to confess or provide details about the other murders, maintaining his position that he was wrongfully convicted. Today, John Norman Collins remains incarcerated at the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility in Jackson, Michigan. At 77 years old, he continues to receive letters from people fascinated by his case, particularly women drawn to the mystery of what transformed an all-American college student into a killer. The Michigan murders case was overshadowed in the media by the more sensational Manson family killings that occurred around the same time in 1969. While Charles Manson became a household name, John Norman Collins faded into obscurity, known primarily to true crime enthusiasts and those who lived through the terror he created. But for the families of Mary Flesser, Joan Schell, Jane Mixer, Marilyn Skelton, Dawn Basom, Alice Callum, and Karen Sue Beineman, the obscurity doesn't matter. Their daughters, sisters, and friends became victims of a predator who hunted with methodical precision for 2 years, forever changing the sense of safety in communities that had believed they were immune to such evil. The case stands as a reminder that monsters often hide behind the most ordinary facades, that evil can flourish in the most unsuspecting places, and that the capacity for human cruelty can emerge from backgrounds that offer no obvious warning signs. John Norman Collins proved that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most harmless, most normal, most like the young men parents want their daughters to meet. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, hunting in plain sight, while an entire community searched for shadows. In the end, his story is not just about the crimes he committed, but about the frightening realization that evil can wear a familiar face, speak with a charming voice, and walk among us completely undetected until the moment it chooses to strike. The 7 young women who died deserved futures filled with love, achievement, and joy. Instead, they became victims of a killer who saw them not as human beings, but as objects for his twisted gratification. Their stories remind us that behind every statistic, every case file, every true crime narrative are real people whose lives were cut short by inexplicable cruelty. John Norman Collins may have faded from public memory, but his crimes remain a chilling example of how evil can hide in the most unexpected places, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its true face. In the suburbs of Salem, Oregon, in the late 1960s, neighbors knew Jerome Jerry Brudos as a quiet electronics technician who lived with his wife and 2 young children in a modest ranch house. He fixed radios and televisions, worked steady hours, and kept to himself. To those who passed him on the street, he seemed unremarkable, just another face in the crowd of middle-class America. But behind the closed doors of his garage workshop, Jerry Brudos was living a nightmare that defied comprehension. a nightmare that would eventually claim the lives of 4 young women and forever change how people thought about the monsters who might be living next door. What made Jerry Brudos so terrifying wasn't his appearance or his demeanor. It was the simple, chilling fact that evil can wear the most ordinary mask, smile the most neighborly smile, and commit the most unspeakable acts while maintaining a facade of perfect normalcy. This is the story of a man whose childhood obsessions twisted into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. A man who turned a shoe fetish into a murder spree that would earn him the names the Lust Killer and the Shoe Fetish Slayer. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota, the younger of 2 sons. From the moment he drew his first breath, Jerry was an unwanted disappointment. His mother, Eileen, had desperately wanted a daughter and made no secret of her disgust at giving birth to another son. While his older brother Larry was showered with affection and praise, Jerry was treated like a burden, a mistake, something that should have been different. Eileen's resentment wasn't subtle. She would dress Jerry in girls' clothing as a form of humiliation, as if she could somehow force him to become the daughter she had wanted. The family moved frequently during Jerry's early years, bouncing between South Dakota, Oregon, and California. Each move seemed to deepen his isolation, and his mother's hostility only grew stronger with time. By the age of 5, something inside Jerry had already begun to twist. It started with a pair of high-heeled shoes. Jerry was playing in a local junkyard when he discovered the shoes, black patent leather with spike heels, abandoned among the rusted car parts and discarded appliances. Something about them fascinated him. He slipped them on his small feet and felt a strange thrill, a sensation he couldn't understand but didn't want to lose. When he brought the shoes home, his mother's reaction was explosive. She screamed at him, called him wicked, and burned the shoes right in front of him. As Jerry watched the flames consume the leather and metal, something fundamental shifted in his young mind. The humiliation, the loss, the inexplicable attraction to the shoes, it all fused into a psychological wound that would never heal. From that moment, Jerry's fascination with women's footwear became an obsession. He tried to steal his first-grade teacher's shoes from under her desk. He broke into neighbors' homes to take women's underwear and shoes. What had started as childhood curiosity had become a compulsion that controlled his every thought. His behavior escalated throughout his teenage years. He would stalk local women, sometimes knocking them unconscious just to steal their shoes. The violence was always secondary to the fetish. He wasn't interested in hurting people for the sake of hurting them. He was interested in what they wore on their feet. At 17, Jerry crossed a line that should have been a warning to everyone around him. He abducted a teenage girl at knife point, forced her to strip naked, and took photographs of her nude body. When caught, he was sent to Oregon State Hospital's psychiatric ward for evaluation. The doctors who examined Jerry found a deeply troubled young man with an obvious hatred for his mother and a disturbing set of sexual fetishes. But they also found someone who seemed immature rather than dangerous, troubled rather than evil. After just a few months of treatment, they released him back into the world, confident that he had learned his lesson. They couldn't have been more wrong. Jerry finished high school, served briefly in the military before being discharged for his bizarre behavior, and eventually found work as an electronics technician. Around age 22, he married a quiet, unassuming woman named Darcy Metzler. To the outside world, it seemed like Jerry had straightened himself out, found stability, and moved past his troubled adolescence. The couple settled in the Portland area and had 2 children. Jerry worked steady jobs, paid his bills, and played the role of suburban father with convincing normalcy. But the fetishes hadn't disappeared. They had simply gone underground. Jerry continued breaking into homes to steal women's clothing and shoes. He had a secret collection hidden in his garage workshop, and he would spend hours dressing in women's clothing, admiring high-heeled shoes, and feeding the psychological hunger that had consumed him since childhood. For years, this seemed to be enough. Jerry could live his double life, responsible family man by day, secret fetishist by night, without anyone getting hurt. But obsessions have a way of growing, and what starts as fantasy eventually demands reality. On January 26, 1968, fantasy became murder. 19-year-old Linda Slauson was working her way through college by selling encyclopedias door to door. It was hard work, but Linda was determined and personable, and she had developed a good rapport with many of her customers. On that cold January morning, she was making her rounds through the Portland suburbs, carrying her sample case and wearing the professional attire her job required, including a pair of high-heeled shoes. Jerry was at home that day when Linda knocked on his door. He later claimed that he hadn't planned what happened next, that it was simply a moment of opportunity that spiraled out of control. But given what investigators would later learn about Jerry's escalating behavior, it seems more likely that he had been building toward this moment for years. Jerry invited Linda inside, pretending to be interested in purchasing a set of encyclopedias. Once she was in his home, alone and unsuspecting, he attacked her. He bludgeoned her into unconsciousness, then strangled her to death. But for Jerry, death was just the beginning. After killing Linda, Jerry's true depravity revealed itself. He carried her body to his garage workshop, where he spent hours playing out his twisted fantasies. He dressed her corpse in different outfits, posed it for photographs, and engaged in acts of necrophilia that defied human understanding. When he was finished with her body, Jerry made a decision that would become his signature. He cut off one of Linda's feet to keep as a trophy. He wanted a permanent reminder of his crime, something he could admire and use to relive the experience whenever he wanted. Jerry disposed of Linda's body by throwing it into the Willamette River from a bridge on Interstate 5, weighted down with heavy car parts to ensure it would never surface. Her body was never found, and for months, Linda Slauson was simply another missing person in a world where young women disappeared all too often. Jerry had tasted murder, and he found that he liked it. More than liked it, he craved it. 10 months passed before Jerry killed again, but he used that time to perfect his methods. He studied the news coverage of Linda's disappearance, learning what mistakes to avoid. He refined his workshop, creating a more private space where he could indulge his fantasies without fear of discovery, and he began planning his next kill. On November 26, 1968, 23-year-old Jan Whitney was driving home to spend Thanksgiving with her family when her car broke down on Interstate 5 between Salem and Albany. It was the kind of random mechanical failure that happens to everyone, a minor problem that should have resulted in nothing more than an inconvenient delay. But Jerry was driving the same stretch of highway that night, and when he saw Jan standing beside her disabled vehicle, he saw opportunity. Jerry pulled over and offered to help, presenting himself as a good Samaritan who just wanted to lend a hand to a stranded motorist. Jan was grateful for the assistance and accepted his offer to drive her to his home in Salem to call for a tow truck. Once they reached his house, Jerry's mask slipped away. He strangled Jan in his car, then carried her body into his garage workshop for what had become his ritual. Like Linda before her, Jan became a victim not just of murder, but of Jerry's necrophilic fantasies and his obsession with keeping trophies from his kills. This time, Jerry removed one of Jan's breasts, which he later used as a paperweight on his workbench. He also made plaster casts of various body parts, creating permanent mementos of his crimes that he could admire whenever the urge struck him. Jerry kept Jan's body in his garage for several days, repeatedly returning to engage in necrophilia and take photographs. When he finally tired of his plaything, he tied her corpse to a heavy piece of railroad iron and threw it into the Willamette River, along with Linda Slauson's severed foot, which had been decomposing in his workshop for nearly a year. For Jerry, murder had become a hobby. For the families of his victims, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for decades. By early 1969, Jerry's confidence had grown to the point of recklessness. He had killed 2 women and disposed of their bodies without leaving any evidence that connected him to their disappearances. He was certain that he was too smart to get caught, too careful to make the kinds of mistakes that brought down other killers. That arrogance would prove to be his downfall. On March 27th, 1969, 18-year-old Karen Sprinker was an Oregon State University chemistry student who had come home for a brief visit with her family. She was supposed to meet her mother for lunch at a downtown Salem restaurant, a simple family gathering that should have been one of those forgettable pleasant moments that make up a normal life. Karen parked her car in the garage of the Meyer and Frank department store and began walking toward the restaurant. She never made it. Jerry was in the parking garage that day, dressed in women's clothing as part of his ongoing fetishistic behavior. When he saw Karen walking past in high-heeled shoes and a miniskirt, something inside him snapped. This wasn't a planned kill like the others. It was pure impulse, the action of a predator who could no longer control his urges. Jerry approached Karen at gunpoint and forced her into his station wagon. Once again, he drove a victim to his house in Salem, where the pattern repeated itself with horrifying consistency. Karen was sexually assaulted, strangled to death, and then subjected to Jerry's necrophilic fantasies. This time, Jerry removed both of Karen's breasts as trophies, adding them to his growing collection of body parts. He photographed her corpse in various poses and positions, creating a permanent record of his depravity. When Jerry finally disposed of Karen's body, he tied it to a car transmission and threw it into the Long Tom River near Monroe, Oregon. But this time, something went wrong with his disposal method. The knots he used were distinctive, tied in a specific pattern that would eventually help investigators connect the dots. Just 4 weeks after Karen's murder, Jerry's bloodlust had reached a fever pitch. On April 22nd, 1969, he attempted to abduct another young woman from a Portland State University parking garage, but his intended victim fought back, biting his thumb and escaping before he could get her into his vehicle. The failed kidnapping should have been a warning to Jerry that he was becoming careless, that his luck was running out. Instead, it only seemed to fuel his desperation. The next day, April 23rd, Jerry struck again. This time, his victim was 22-year-old Linda Selly, who had gone to a Portland shopping center to buy a gift for her boyfriend. Like Karen before her, Linda was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when Jerry's obsessions demanded another victim. Jerry abducted Linda from the Lloyd Center parking lot and brought her back to his Salem workshop. The murder followed the same pattern as the others: sexual assault, strangulation, necrophilia, and trophy taking. Linda's body joined Karen's in the Long Tom River, weighted down with car parts and tied with Jerry's distinctive knots. By this point, Jerry had killed 4 women in just over a year, and his crimes were escalating in both frequency and recklessness. He had become so confident in his ability to avoid detection that he had started taking greater risks, acting on impulse rather than careful planning. But 4 bodies in the water, even weighted down, don't stay hidden forever. On May 10th, 1969, a fisherman discovered Linda Selly's decomposing corpse in the Long Tom River. 2 days later, Karen Sprinker's body was found just 50 feet away. Both corpses showed signs of the distinctive mutilation that would become Jerry's signature, and both were tied to car parts using the same unusual knots. The discovery of 2 bodies in such close proximity immediately told investigators that they were dealing with a serial killer. The copper wire used in the bindings, tied with the skill of someone familiar with electrical work, suggested that their killer might be an electrician or someone with similar technical training. The fact that both victims were young, attractive women told investigators something about their killer's preferences. The mutilation suggested sexual motivation. The disposal method indicated someone with access to heavy car parts and a detailed knowledge of the local river systems. For the first time since Linda Slauson's disappearance 15 months earlier, law enforcement had solid evidence to work with. They had bodies, they had a method, and they had a geographic profile. What they needed now was a suspect. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: Jerry's own arrogance. In his desperation to find more victims, Jerry had begun calling college dormitories at Oregon State University, pretending to be a Vietnam veteran looking for dates. One female student actually agreed to go out with him, and during their brief encounter, Jerry made a mistake that would cost him everything. He casually mentioned the 2 dead women who had been found in the river, discussing the murders in a way that struck his date as oddly specific and disturbing. When police later interviewed female students as part of their investigation, this woman came forward with information about the strange man who had called her dormitory. Police asked the student to help them set up a sting operation. When Jerry called again to arrange another date, she agreed to meet him at her dormitory. Instead of finding a potential victim, Jerry was confronted by 2 detectives who wanted to ask him some questions. Jerry handled the initial questioning with the same cool confidence that had served him throughout his killing spree. He answered all their questions politely, provided his name and occupation, and gave no obvious signs of guilt or nervousness. To the detectives, he seemed like just another dead-end lead in a frustrating investigation. But when they ran a background check on Jerome Jerry Brudos, red flags started appearing everywhere. Jerry had a history of violence against women dating back to his teenage years. He lived in the Portland area, where Linda Slauson had disappeared. He had moved to Salem just months before Jan Whitney's murder. He worked as an electronics technician, which explained the skilled wire work found on the bodies. And most damning of all, he lived just blocks from the Meyer and Frank department store where Karen Sprinker had been abducted. When detectives obtained a search warrant for Jerry's home on May 25, 1969, they found a workshop that looked like something from a horror movie. Nylon rope, copper wire, and women's clothing were scattered throughout the garage. Photographs of partially nude women were hidden in various locations. And most shocking of all, they found what appeared to be severed human breasts being used as paperweights on Jerry's workbench. Jerry was arrested on the spot, and under interrogation, his facade of innocence quickly crumbled. When confronted with the physical evidence found in his garage, Jerry began confessing to crimes that investigators hadn't even connected to him yet. Over the course of several days, Jerry provided a detailed confession that laid out his entire killing spree from Linda Slauson to Linda Saley. He described each murder in graphic detail, explaining his methods, his motivations, and his disposal techniques. He showed no remorse for his crimes and no understanding of the pain he had caused to his victims' families. What emerged from Jerry's confession was a portrait of a killer driven by sexual fantasies that had completely overwhelmed his ability to distinguish between right and wrong. He saw his victims not as human beings with their own lives and dreams, but as objects to be used for his sexual gratification and then discarded when he was finished with them. Jerry was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Saley. Although he confessed to killing Linda Slauson, prosecutors chose not to charge him with that murder because her body had never been found, and they didn't want to risk a case that might be harder to prove. Jerry initially pled not guilty by reason of insanity, hoping that his obvious mental illness might spare him from a life sentence. But psychiatric evaluations unanimously concluded that while Jerry was certainly disturbed, he was not legally insane. He understood the difference between right and wrong, and he had known that his actions were illegal when he committed them. Faced with overwhelming evidence and expert testimony that contradicted his insanity defense, Jerry changed his plea to guilty on all 3 counts of murder. On July 28, 1969, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences in the Oregon State Penitentiary. Jerry's wife, Darcy, divorced him immediately after his conviction and moved away from Oregon with their 2 children, changing their names and disappearing from public view. She had been completely unaware of her husband's crimes, though neighbors later reported seeing her help Jerry carry suspicious packages to his car on several occasions. The discovery of Jerry's crimes sent shockwaves through the Salem community and beyond. Here was a man who had lived among them for years, working normal jobs, raising a family, and maintaining the appearance of respectability, while secretly committing some of the most depraved murders in Oregon history. Jerry's case became a landmark in criminal psychology, one of the first detailed studies of a serial killer whose crimes were driven primarily by sexual fetishes rather than more conventional motives like money or revenge. His case was later featured in FBI behavioral analysis training and influenced the development of criminal profiling techniques that are still used today. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Jerry Brudos was not what he did, but how ordinary he seemed while he was doing it. He didn't fit the popular image of a serial killer as a wild-eyed maniac or obvious monster. He was a quiet suburban father who happened to torture and murder young women in his spare time. Jerry spent the rest of his life in prison, becoming the longest-serving inmate in Oregon Department of Corrections history. He never showed any genuine remorse for his crimes, though he occasionally granted interviews to law enforcement officials and researchers studying violent behavior. In one particularly chilling exchange with a detective, Jerry was asked if he felt any sympathy for his victims or their families. Jerry picked up a piece of paper from the table between them, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it on the floor. "That much," he said. "I care about those girls as much as I care about that piece of wadded-up paper." On March 28th, 2006, Jerry Brudos died of liver cancer in the Oregon State Penitentiary Infirmary. He was 67 years old and had spent nearly 4 decades behind bars. His death brought a sense of relief to the families of his victims, who had lived for years with the fear that he might someday be released on parole. For Linda Slauson's family, Jerry's death was particularly significant because he had never revealed where he had disposed of her body. They had spent nearly 40 years without closure, unable to properly bury their daughter and sister. Jerry took that secret with him to the grave, one final act of cruelty against people who had already suffered more than anyone should have to endure. The case of Jerry Brudos stands as a stark reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary face, live in the most suburban neighborhood, and commit the most unspeakable acts while maintaining a facade of complete normalcy. He wasn't a monster from a horror movie or a obviously deranged madman ranting on street corners. He was a quiet electronics technician who lived next door to ordinary people and committed extraordinary acts of evil in his spare time. He was proof that the most dangerous predators are often the ones we never see coming, the ones who smile and wave when we pass them on the street, the ones who seem so normal that no one would ever suspect what they're capable of doing in the privacy of their own homes. Jerry Brudos transformed from a troubled child with a shoe fetish into one of Oregon's most notorious serial killers, not through some sudden psychological break, but through a gradual escalation that took decades to reach its horrifying conclusion. Each step along the way seemed small and manageable to Jerry, each new violation just slightly worse than the last, until he found himself capable of acts that would have been unthinkable to the 5-year-old boy who first slipped on those high-heeled shoes in a junkyard. His story is a reminder that monsters are made, not born, and that the line between fantasy and reality, between fetish and murder, can be crossed so gradually that the killer himself might not even notice when he's stepped over the edge into irredeemable evil. The 4 women Jerry killed, Linda Slauson, Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally, were more than just victims in a criminal case. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and students with hopes and dreams and futures that were cut short by one man's inability to control his darkest impulses. Their names deserve to be remembered not just as entries in a criminal history, but as reminders of the human cost of evil and of the vigilance required to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Jerry Brudos may be dead, but the questions his case raises about the nature of evil, the development of violent behavior, and the ability of some people to hide their true nature behind masks of normalcy remain as relevant today as they were in 1969. In a world where serial killers continue to walk among us, appearing as ordinary as the person next door, Jerry's story serves as both a historical record and a warning about the monsters that can hide in plain sight. In September of 1951, in a small hospital in Schenectady, New York, a baby was born into circumstances so dire that county doctors would later declare him unadoptable. His name was Paul Zeininger, and when his biological mother finally surrendered him at 6 months old, he was functioning at what medical professionals described as an animalistic level. He had been so severely neglected that he was eating his own feces just to survive. This child would grow up to become Gerald Eugen Stano, and by the time authorities caught him in 1980, he would confess to murdering 41 women across 3 states. But here's what makes Gerald's story particularly chilling. Decades later, investigators would begin to wonder if he was actually a killer at all, or something far more disturbing. A man so broken by his past that he would confess to murders he never committed just to feel important. Gerald's biological mother had already given birth to 4 other children before him. 3 she had put up for adoption. The 4th, a daughter with severe brain damage, was the only one she chose to keep. When Gerald came along, she decided once again that she couldn't handle another child. But by the time social services intervened, the damage was already done. A nurse named Norma Stano first saw baby Paul at 13 months old. Despite warnings from medical staff that the child was beyond help, she and her husband Eugene were determined to adopt him. The reports were devastating. The toddler would remove his own diaper and play with his feces. He showed no capacity for normal human interaction, and doctors questioned whether he could ever be rehabilitated. But the Stanos saw something in him, and 6 months later, Paul Zeininger officially became Gerald Eugen Stano. By all accounts, the Stanos were loving, devoted parents. They provided Gerald with stability, education, and genuine care. But the early trauma had already carved deep scars into his developing mind. He was a bedwetter until age 10, struggled academically in every subject except music, and displayed an alarming pattern of compulsive lying. In one particularly telling incident, he stole money from his adoptive father's wallet to pay fellow track team members to let him win races, simply so he wouldn't appear to be a complete failure. Gerald was constantly bullied at school. He was awkward, strange, and seemed to invite ridicule from his peers. At 14, he was arrested for pulling a false fire alarm. Later, he was caught throwing rocks at cars from a highway overpass. These weren't pranks. They were desperate attempts at getting attention, at feeling some measure of control in a world where he perpetually felt powerless. He didn't graduate high school until he was 21. After earning his diploma, he enrolled in computer school and briefly worked at a local hospital before being fired for stealing from coworkers. The pattern would repeat itself throughout his young adult life. Job after job lost due to theft, tardiness, or simply his inability to function normally in social situations. When his adoptive parents moved to Ormond Beach, Florida, Gerald followed. It was there, according to his later confessions, that his alleged killing spree began. But even from the start, there was something different about Gerald's supposed crimes. Unlike most serial killers who develop specific methods or target particular types of victims, Gerald claimed to kill randomly, using different weapons, different approaches, with no apparent sexual motive. His alleged victims were primarily young women, hitchhikers, sex workers, runaways, women society often overlooked. According to his confessions, he would pick them up, sometimes engage in conversation, then suddenly turn violent. He claimed to use knives, guns, strangulation, whatever was convenient. But notably, unlike most serial killers, Gerald never raped his victims. When asked about his motivation, he would simply say, "I just can't stand a bitchy chick." The first confirmed case authorities could link to Gerald was the 1973 murder of 17-year-old Kathy Lee Scharf. She had been hitchhiking when someone picked her up, stabbed her to death, and dumped her body. For years, the case remained unsolved, just another tragic statistic in Florida's growing list of murdered young women. Then, in April 1980, everything changed. A sex worker named Donna Hensley stumbled into a Daytona Beach police station, bleeding from 30 stab wounds. She told officers that a man she knew as Gerald had attacked her in her motel room during what was supposed to be a routine transaction. She fought him off and escaped, but barely. When police arrested Gerald Eugene Stano, they had no idea they were about to open one of the most controversial cases in criminal justice history. Detective Paul Crowe was assigned to interrogate Gerald, and what happened next would be debated for decades. Gerald began confessing, not just to the attack on Donna Hensley, but to murder after murder after murder. He provided detailed accounts of crimes spanning multiple states and nearly a decade. He drew maps, described victims' clothing, recalled specific conversations. It seemed like an investigator's dream, a killer willing to clear dozens of cold cases with his confessions. But there was something troubling about these confessions. Some of Gerald's details were inconsistent. Timelines didn't always match. And most disturbing of all, according to Detective James Gadberry, who had originally arrested Gerald, Detective Crowe was feeding Gerald information about the crimes during their interviews. In 1986, Gadberry signed a legal affidavit stating that he had witnessed Crowe spoon-feeding Gerald intimate details of unsolved murders, which Gerald would then repeat back as his own confessions. Other veteran officers came forward with similar concerns. They had watched Crowe gather information from old case files, newspaper archives, and other jurisdictions, then present these details to Gerald during questioning. It appeared that Gerald, desperate for attention and acceptance, was simply parroting back whatever information Crowe provided, crafting elaborate false confessions to please his interrogator. The controversy deepened when it was revealed that Crowe had been using newspaper reports to supplement his knowledge of cold cases. During sworn testimony in federal court, Crowe admitted that he had enlisted the help of a local reporter to research unsolved murders, using archived newspaper stories to gather details that Gerald later confessed to knowing. In 1995, Crowe was removed from office by a grand jury, citing corruption. But by then, it was too late for Gerald's. Based largely on his own confessions, he had been convicted and sentenced to death. The most damning evidence was often nothing more than his own words, words that investigators now suspected had been coached and manipulated. Despite confessing to 41 murders, Gerald was ultimately tried for just one, the killing of Kathy Lee Scharf. The reason was simple. There was virtually no physical evidence linking him to any of the crimes except his confessions. Even more troubling, in 2007, nearly a decade after Gerald's execution, FBI lab results revealed that DNA evidence from Scharf's body did not match Gerald. Unidentified pubic hairs recovered from the victim could not have come from the man who had been executed for her murder. This evidence had never been presented during Gerald's trial, and the physical evidence was destroyed shortly after his execution. Gerald Eugene Stano spent 18 years on death row, maintaining his innocence in his final years. He claimed that he had been coerced, threatened, and held without proper legal representation. His adoptive parents, who had never stopped believing in his innocence, visited him regularly, watching their adopted son waste away in a cell for crimes he may never have committed. On March 23, 1998, Gerald was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison. For his final meal, he requested Delmonico steak, a baked potato with sour cream and bacon bits, salad with blue cheese dressing, lima beans, a half-gallon of mint chocolate chip ice cream, and 2 liters of Pepsi. His final words were a declaration of innocence. "I am innocent. I am frightened. I was threatened, and I was held month after month without any real legal representation. I confess to crimes I did not commit." The case of Gerald Eugene Stano raises disturbing questions about the nature of justice, the reliability of confessions, and the devastating impact of childhood trauma. Was he a prolific serial killer who managed to evade physical evidence for decades? Or was he a deeply damaged man, broken by early neglect and abuse, who found a twisted form of validation by confessing to crimes he never committed? What we know for certain is this: a baby was born into circumstances so horrific that he was deemed beyond help. Despite the loving care of adoptive parents, that early trauma never healed. Whether Gerald became a killer or simply a man so desperate for attention that he would claim to be one, his story is a testament to the lasting power of childhood wounds and the complex ways they can manifest in adult behavior. The families of the alleged victims deserve answers. The criminal justice system demands certainty, but Gerald Eugene Stano's case reminds us that sometimes the most disturbing truth is that we may never know the real truth at all. In a system designed to distinguish between guilt and innocence, Gerald existed in a gray area, neither completely exonerated nor conclusively proven guilty, but rather trapped in the tragic space between a broken childhood and a broken system. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the reliability of our justice system, and the devastating long-term effects of childhood trauma. Whether Gerald was a killer or simply a man destroyed by his past, his case stands as a stark reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often not born, but made, shaped by circumstances beyond their control and systems that fail to protect the most vulnerable among us. Today, investigators continue to reopen cases that Gerald confessed to, searching for the truth in a maze of false confessions and corrupted evidence. But for Gerald Eugene Stano, the search for truth ended in Florida's electric chair, taking with him the secrets of what really happened during those dark years when women disappeared and a damaged man claimed responsibility for their deaths.